All right, everybody. Welcome back to Top Comics Pressing. In this video, what I want to do is go over a question that I get asked an awful lot, and that is, should I take the CGC slab that I have, crack it, press it, resend it to CGC, and hope for a better grade? In a best case scenario, this can be quite profitable or help you beautify a book that you might not otherwise be able to get. But in a worst case scenario, you can end up with a lower grade after spending a considerable amount of money to press, ship, and reslab a book. And so it's a question that you want to take quite seriously and think through some of the pros and cons and how successful you're likely to be with what I call a bump ski, the increase in a CGC grade after working on a book. And so I've selected kind of a smorgasbord of books here, both going to the Silver Age all the way up to True Moderns with a couple in the 80s in between. And I just want to take you through these slabs kind of one by one and evaluate what I might look for in the books. And so starting here, this is a copy of Action Comics Volume 2, Number 9. You can see it as the first full appearance of Calvin Ellis, who is an alternate Superman from Earth 23. It is a very attractive grade of 9.6, but of course that is just a hair shy of the infamous and all-important 9.8. Now, if you use the CGC serial number, you can go to the CGC webpage and look up grader notes for comics, which is always the first thing I would encourage you to do if you're considering cracking open a slab, having the book worked on, and looking for that increase in the grade. In this particular book, if you look at the serial number here, I can bring it up to the camera a little bit so you can see. If you go type that into CGC, you will see that the grader notes are, quote, unavailable, quote. That's very common, particularly for a modern book, particularly if the grade is 9.0 or above. There often are no grader notes. If you're lucky, there are, but most of the time there are not. And so we have to kind of use our better judgment to see if we could get this 9.6 to bump up to the 9.8. Now, on this particular book, certainly for something that's this close to that 9.8, the flaw must be a small one, and we should go look. And if you look very carefully, there is a color breaking tick right there. And that is enough, unfortunately, to keep this book from ever being a 9.8. And if you flip it over on the rear spine, you can see that there is an additional tick right there. Sometimes they let you slide with one tick, but it's going to be really hard to let it slide with two ticks, especially because they line up quite well. And so that's not really going to be something that we can hide or press out, particularly with it on the black segment of the border here. And so this book, I think, is likely capped at the 9.6 grade, and it's one that I think if you cracked, pressed, and resubmitted, you'd come back exactly at a 9.6. So I don't believe that this book was overgraded or undergraded. It's just an example of showing you that there are not grader notes for a lot of modern books. So the next book up here is one from the Silver Age. So this goes to 1964, and I'll zoom up the serial number up on the camera so you can go ahead and look that up on your own if you'd like. This is an Amazing Spider-Man number 8. It is at a 2.5 grade. And at a quick glance around the front cover, it looks pretty good except for this chunk missing there and the chip out of the corner. And so you might be curious why it's a 2.5 grade. In this particular case, that answer is right on the front cover. It says cover detached. And if you look at the rest of the grader notes, it also says that there's moderate staining to the cover, so you can see some of that over in this area, and there's a little bit down here. You can also see that there are multiple creases to cover that break color, multiple pieces out of cover, and multiple tear to cover. And when CGC says cover, they also mean the back cover, so we can flip that over, and we can see that there are indeed tears along this segment of the comic book, as well as up along here and on the top edge. Now, this book does say staining, so in principle, we could crack this open and remove some of the staining or make it look better. In practice, this would be a very poor candidate to do that. The reason is that detached cover is going to limit you to be a 3.0 book. So even if you have a truly mint copy where somebody has just pulled the cover off, you're going to be looking at a 3.0 good, very good copy, at least based on the CGC way that they grade. Of course, all these other defects are only going to compound and lower that, but really with the chunk missing here and the chunk missing there and the detached cover, this is as good as it's ever going to get, even if you remove the stain, even if you fix some of the other things, like maybe make it look a little bit nicer by pulling that cover all the way to the edge. None of that is actually going to move the grade of this book. It is pegged out at a 2.5. Moving on up to a slightly higher grade copy here, we can look at the Amazing Spider-Man number 31. This is the first appearance of Gwen Stacy, very popular comic. This one also says very light staining to cover, light spine stress lines to cover, multiple crease, left top of back cover, so we should look at that, multiple pieces out of top of front cover. And so if I zoom up here, you can grab the serial, but this area right here is quite bad. So you can see it's damaged to the inner wrap, and you've got chew marks all the way through here. And so that damage by itself is enough to justify the 3.0 grade. The other comments of creasing, like right there, or some of the light staining down here on the corner, you know, that is gonna affect the grade, but not enough given the chews up through here and the chews out on the side. And so while this is a nice key issue, oh yeah, and you can see there's more staining right here, kind of in this segment as well as right there. But even if you remove that staining, this damage is gonna cap you at a 3. So not a good candidate there in my opinion. One more Amazing Spider-Man here, the ever-popular first appearance of the Shocker. This one's a considerably higher grade at 7.0, which is a fairly respectable grade for a Silver Age book. This one says light pieces out of cover, light spine stress lines to cover, moderate creasing to cover. So when they say light pieces out of cover, what they're looking at is up here. You can see that there's some chipping along that edge, and you can see that there is chipping right along here. And so that is considered pieces out, and that's enough to significantly lower the grade of the book. Now, when they talk about light or moderate creasing to cover, what they're looking at here is all this crease along the top edge. It's very subtle, and it's unfortunate for a book like this because often the cover was just a little bit fatter than the book, and the way that this most likely occurred is somebody slid it into a bag with a board, and they pulled the tape over the top edge, and the top edge just curled that cover around the inner wraps and caused that damage. You can see the back cover is quite nice, so not a whole lot going on here. Maybe a little bit, very slight bit of staining up top, but not enough to be true staining. Maybe a little bit of very light foxing. Certainly not enough where it was even noted on the CGC grader notes. There is a little bit more damage to the bottom corner right here. But other than that, very nice key issue, very bright. You can see it presents very well for a 7, given that the defects are really on the edges. And so this is what I would consider a very nice copy, but not one worth cracking and pressing, particularly with the costs of those Silver Age books. So jumping a couple of decades here into the future, we can jump forward to the first appearance of Rocket Raccoon, or at least the first comic book appearance. Rocket Raccoon first appeared in a magazine, but this is generally considered the first comic book appearance. First cover appearance, a very iconic character now who's been in the MCU. This one says in the CGC grader notes, so again, you can grab that number yourself and look it up as long as you have a paid membership. So it says light creasing to cover, light finger bends to cover, light scuffing to cover, moderate bends to cover, moderate spine stress lines to cover. Now this one is tempting to consider a crack and press for because the word bend appears in it twice. So light finger bends on cover and moderate bends to cover. But that's not really what's keeping the grade down. So if we zoom in and look here down the spine, you can see that there are quite a few defects as you scroll, and some of these are going to be a little bit bigger ticks, like especially in here. Those ticks now are not just really a tick, they're really almost starting to become a tear. And so even with a really high grade book otherwise, these really deep spine lines are going to be very limiting. If we flip it over, you can see that those are clearly on the back, and you can just kind of see that in the glare, that there are more tears than creases. I am struggling at the moment to find the light bends to the cover, but I picked this book for the video. Oh, right there. So they must be talking about the bends around that staple. And right there, you can kind of see it. So that is either a little bit of pressing reversion, or what was more likely is it was pressed flat, stayed flat, but the book was shaken. Particularly if you have those deep creases, that paper is forever damaged there, and it's very easy to have the book kind of fall back into place. Some people call that reversion, which is definitely the case if you don't have enough humidity and then deal with the humidity properly in the press, but it can also happen just because the paper fibers are broken, and if you shake the comic, those fibers are going to recollapse in on themselves. A little bit of creasing down here in the corner. The reason I picked this copy to talk about is because it mentions finger bends, and I wanted to talk about finger bends. If I can find the ones I was looking for, yeah, right up in here is the one I'm trying to get a good view on the glare for you. Finger bends generally do press out, but they are not 100%. The difference is if the bend is light, it'll for sure press out, but if it gets deep enough where it has actually scratched or cracked the gloss, often when CGC looks at it after a press, what they see is the lack of shine and the glare, and then that gloss being cracked always counts it as a finger bend, even if you've pressed it out and the paper is physically flat. So you do want to be careful with finger bends depending on how deep they are. So this next book is a favorite. It's probably one of the biggest modern books that there are out there of true moderns. Ultimate Fallout 4, a very nice first appearance of Miles Morales. Make sure you can see the serial number there. This one says bend, bottom of front cover through book, light bend, top of back cover. So let's see if we can find the light bend at top of back cover. And it is indeed right there. Let's see if we can see that. That's what they're calling a bend there, is that break in gloss. Now that, to me, looks like it has a high probability of being broken gloss and not being a true bend. It is definitely not color breaking, so if we look down straight at it, we don't see a white line through there. But even though it is not color breaking, it can still have damaged the gloss to a point where we won't be able to fix it. The other was light bends through book here on bottom, and you can see them right there as I move that in the light. So those light bends through book, I don't see those on the back cover, so I'm not so sure why it said, oh, maybe right there, could be right there. Right there, maybe. But these definitely look like they might be pressable. And because the value of this book is so dependent on that grade, particularly at the high end, this one to me is likely worth the gamble to have cracked, pressed, and resubmitted. And the reason I say that is, you know, this book in the 9.2 range is going to be worth several $100s, and if I make it a 9.4 or a 9.6, it'll probably be worth a couple $100s more. And because of that, the you know, roughly $25 to have CGC reslab it, and maybe $20 round trip to have it cleaned and pressed is probably worth the roll of the dice. Certainly, worst case, it's not going to come back a whole lot lower. And so the Ultimate Fallout 4 there, I think, is a nice candidate for a crack and press. Moving on up here, this is the first appearance of Beta Ray Bill, very popular, Thor 337. On first glance, this is a very beautiful copy, and it does not justify that 7.5 grade. And so we should look very carefully at what the grader notes say here. You can see that they say spine stress lines, and if we look carefully, we can see one very clearly right here. Right there. And there's another one right there. See that? And there are another small one up over here that might not come through the light very well. But that by itself, those three lines, would maybe constitute a 9.6, maybe a 9.4, worst case scenario. It says there's a small tear right cover, so we can see that right there. And that is a very small tear, and so that will not have too large of a negative impact on the overall grade. And so, again, nothing here justifies a 7.5. Even with that tear and a trio of small spine ticks, I would consider this to be a very likely 9.2, 9.4 book. But what kills this one is the crease left top back cover. So back cover left top would be up here. And if we go look for it, you can see it right here in the glare. Let's see if I can find that in the glare for you. Not showing up very well on the camera. Just move it a little bit. Right there, you can see that line right here. Yep. And so that crease is roughly, let's see here, a little bit over an inch. So even if this book were a 9.8 candidate and you crease that corner, gonna get a 7.5 grade. And so there's nothing I can do as a presser to put that line back, given that crease definitely clearly goes through gloss. It's been nice and flattened out, but it definitely goes through. These, by the way, are just scuffs on the outside of the CGC slab. So this one, again, not gonna make the return trip. The last one here I have for you is another modern. So this is a ASM 430. It is semi-popular Carnage Silver Surfer cover. So I think people consider this to be the first appearance of Silver Carnage or Carnage Surfer. But a very nice, Amazing Spider-Man, late in the first volume one, in kind of the dead zone of the late 90s. So this one, if you look it up, you're going to be able to see that the greater notes are, quote, unavailable. And so we're going to have to use some better judgment on this particular copy to judge why they have a 9.4 there. Again, starting at a 9.4, we're going to want to look for small damage to the edges, most commonly the spine. And so this one, if we look, we can see a tick right there. So that's very clearly a spine tick. And then if we keep looking, we should be able to see maybe some other kind of damage, because at one spine tick we should be at a 9.6. So let's just flip it over and see if we can find anything more down the spine back here. And I would say yes, right there, there's another tick. That's clearly a white line. Right here is another tick. Right here is another tick. And because the way CGC grades, if those are all considered small ticks, you might still be able to get a 9.6 even with multiple very small ticks, because they're all kind of in the same defect category. But what I think is going to limit this always to being a 9.4 is some very slight damage to this bottom corner. This looks to me to be slightly more severe than what I would consider binding tear damage. So this has a slightly blunted, very small corner damage in conjunction with now several small spine ticks. And so I would not consider this to be a good candidate to grade. I think we can justify that 9.4 with a series of very small spine ticks and some very small damage to the bottom staple. All right, so those are the slabs I wanted to show you and kind of show you why I would not consider cracking and pressing most of these. But when considering, you know, the logic I would go through, what I would do on a book like this is I would consider the greater notes. I'm for certain going to give it a once over from my own eye. So for instance, there is a small tick right there, and there is another small tick right there. And those ticks do not show up on the greater notes. And so you want to be aware that the CGC greater notes are not complete. They're transparent about that. They tell you right away that it's not an exhaustive list of defects. What they're trying to do is just point you out to the largest defect that might justify the grade. So on the Thor book here, it's this back corner crease right through here that's justifying that 7.5 grade. On the Ultimate Fallout 4 here, they're going to call it the bends, whether they be on the front or on the back. That's going to really justify that grade. So in considering should you crack or you know, repress and resubmit a book, what I always like to do is consider what the book might grade at without those defects. And certainly if they didn't call out those spine ticks and I was able to press out the bends down here, and if one were able to press out that bend up there, 2 small spine ticks might get me up to a 9.6. So best case scenario is this comes back a 9.6. And if that's the case, then it was clearly worth the marginal cost of having it cracked, pressed, and resubmitted. On the other hand, if it comes back, even a 9.4 or a 9.2 again, relative to the amount of increased fair market value in this particular book, it's still a small gamble. But for some of these other books, even if this one had only a single spine tick, I still wouldn't suggest resubmitting it because the difference between a 9.4 and a 9.6 on this book is not going to justify, having that expense to have the book cracked out, pressed, and regraded by CGC. The only way that this one would really make sense to justify to get that boost is if we have a decent chance of making a 9.8, which of course is not the case on that. Silver Age books like this one are obviously very dependent on the grade, and if I thought there was a reasonable chance to bump that even to an 8.0, it might be worth cracking this one out because the Silver Age books and even that modestly high grade range are so highly sought after and prized. In this particular case, I think this one is done for as well as this one. And so, I kind of ask myself, what is the book grade at now? Does that grade justified? If so, then that's okay. And then you can identify the defects that might be removed with a clean and press. And if removing those defects, then just regrade it with those defects imagined to be removed and see if you're going to come up with anything higher. So for this book, even if one cleaned off these stains, you're never going to be able to put that paper back. And so there's no reason to crack that one out. Same is true with this book with the detached cover. Even if you went through the whole process, you're not going to reattach that. And so especially not with the chunk missing right here. And so there's no reason to take that one out, even if you could in principle remove the stains. All right, so that's it for this video. I want to thank you for your attention. If you're enjoying the content, please subscribe, like, follow, etc. As always, feel free to leave a comment or reach out to me on a different platform. Thank you for your time.